Hey, welcome to Brute Facts. So tonight we have Ben with Real Atheology. Check out his YouTube channel and website, Real Atheology. All the descriptions, links are below the video. We have Than from Exploring Reality, who's a new guest on the show. Ben is returning. And we are going to talk about a debate that Than had with another gentleman. And the debate didn't go as expected. It wasn't as quality as it could have been. So we're going to talk about that tonight and go over some of the key points. Stick around. Thank you for everybody that's here. Get ready for the show. Ben, welcome back. Than, welcome for the first time. How you guys doing?
I'm doing good.
I'm doing well.
Than, tell us a little bit about yourself, your channel, and what you aim to do.
Yeah. So my name's Than Christopoulus. My full name's Athanasios. Than came about because I was in a screamo band in high school, and we were too lazy to put my full name on a CD cover. And I started a nonprofit ministry called Exploring Reality, where my goal is just to kind of teach Christians how to better defend their faith, argue for their faith, because I've noticed that a lot in the evangelical circles, a lot of people just tend to say some things that don't really aid into the dialectic at all. And so that's just kind of my goal. And yeah.
Okay, cool. Ben, pretty sure a lot of my audience already knows who you are, but a little bit about yourself and kind of what you aim to do.
So my name is Ben Watkins, and I live with my wife and daughter in Norfolk, Virginia, and I'm a host of Real Atheology, a philosophy of religion podcast, where we explore questions in the philosophy of religion from non-theistic perspectives. And we are looking to raise the level of discourse between theists and atheists, especially online. We feel like we're in a niche area, kind of, an area of discourse that is lacking, where we take these questions seriously and we engage with theists charitably and really just kind of follow the latest developments in the philosophy of religion. We interview leading philosophers on both sides of the question of God's existence, and we explore models of religion that don't involve something like perfect being theism. So seeing what our concepts of religion can look like after we've discarded something like perfect being theism.
All right. And Ben, Than does fantastic work. Check his, I don't think I even mentioned his YouTube channel. He has a YouTube channel also, Exploring Reality. He's done a few things on there. He's had a couple of interviews. He's had done some work on the mythicism of Christ, the resurrection. He does pretty good stuff. And Ben, both of these guys are friends, and Ben's done fantastic work over at Real Atheology. I've been following him for quite a while. Pretty smart cat. So make sure you check his stuff out too. So I guess we'll dive right into it. So this is for those who are a lot of people who didn't see the debate. Than had a debate about whether there is evidence for the existence of God, not whether God exists, but is there evidence? And I think a big part of the disconnect was what one considers evidence. And I think a lot of times that's where these debates kind of get muddled or we talk past each other. So Ben's going to share with us work that he put together to kind of explain some of these things a little better. So I'm going to, let's see, Ben, I don't have your screen to share.
I got you, buddy. Let me pull it up here. You should have it now.
Okay, here we go. All right, so let's see. Let's go to full screen layout here so it's easier to read. Okay, if you will. So is there evidence for theism? If you'll pick it up from there, Ben, and kind of give us an idea of your thoughts on this and kind of where you're going with your direction.
Yeah, so I think this would the conversation would really benefit a lot if we just kind of thought of this as a debate review. And so to really just kind of recharacterize Than's position, you know, kind of the argument that he was putting on the table, and then just kind of the different ways in which Mike either failed to interact with what was being offered or just kind of avoided interacted, but in kind of superficial ways. So I think we should, the best place to start is going to be with just the question, is there evidence for theism? So Dan, walk me through your thought process. Why this question?
So are you asking more specifically, like, why did we choose this debate topic?
Yeah. What was your thought process behind it? Because I think, I really think that you've already kind of won the debate just by phrasing this question. So like, what were you going for with this question? Why this question rather than some other question?
Yeah. So I actually, when I actually accepted the debate offer from my opponent, I actually told him we can do the topic of, is belief in God reasonable or rational? So I was actually willing to take a higher burden of proof, and he felt so strongly that there is no evidence for God that he wanted to do this instead. So I actually didn't even want to do this debate topic.
So I think that's a really strong move, though, because it really puts a low burden of proof on your part, just because you can kind of almost get, as long as some probabilistic claim you can give reasons for saying is true, in the absence of defeaters, you kind of just have this argument on it's kind of follows almost trivially that there's evidence for something. So I think Mike's first mistake was even accepting the debate. And what I mean by that is that the question that he wanted to try to answer was the wrong question. He should just already concede that there is some evidence for theism. And we'll get into that in a little bit when we characterize your concept of evidence. What I want to get at here is that Mike the question that should have been on the table is, why is there something rather than nothing?
Mm-hmm.
Because this is this is the sort of question that the cosmological argument is built around.
Yep.
And, if you want to engage with that argument, you're going to offer your own answer to this question. And if you say, well, we just don't even have to answer that question, or that's a meaningless question, that's itself an answer to the question.
Yeah.
The question doesn't just go away. That's the most important, I think, central question. And so Mike didn't do himself any favors at this point in the debate by accepting this other question as the central, he has an uphill battle here. Like, he's got to, at this point, give, at least some form of defeater for every probabilistic claim that comes up in favor of God's existence. And I think you just can accede there are some evidential considerations that can be evidence for theism. However, we're going to look at the total evidence, or we're going to, hey, we're going to step back and look at how worldviews clash in here. What are the theoretical virtues between when we do like a worldview comparison, something like that. That's the conversation I think you showed up to have.
Yeah.
And well, those who have watched the debate will know that that's not the conversation that got had. And I think a lot of that comes from Mike's acceptance of the debate in these terms, rather than I think that terms that would have been more amenable to you anyways. It sounds like you wanted to have, like, you didn't want to have this conversation of, well, is there evidence, for theism? That's not an interesting claim. You want to give an answer to why is there something rather than nothing, and how that, some answer to that question is a fact that is evidence for theism.
Yep.
That's the more interesting conversation to have, I think.
Yeah. You just remind, all I could think of when towards the end of that is Graham Oppie and his voice. Let's compare theories.
Yeah. Let's just compare theories. Like something like that. I feel like that's, again, like, we get kind of praised for having this approach, but I think this is just kind of the bare minimum.
Yeah.
Like, this is just what you would have to do. Like, I don't know what else you would do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you, Ben. I think it's such a low threshold, to even deny that there's, some evidence for theism.
Yeah.
Just seems like a hard position to defend. Because the basic question, again, as you stated, why is there something rather than nothing? I mean, seems to, possibly point to something other than the reality that we experience in a way. And I don't think that was a winnable debate for Mike, regardless of how strong he could have came. Because, like you said, in the absence of at least, some kind of undercutting defeat, or, it just, how do you even defend that? It's kind of my question.
It's just a wrong hill to die on.
Yeah.
Right. I agree.
That's why I was so surprised when he said, no, that's a dumb one to me.
So I think now would be a good time, Than, for you to kind of put your concept of evidence on the table. Why? Because I thought this is, to be honest with you, this is why I reached out to you, is because when I saw your presentation on your concept of evidence, I was like, yes, this guy's, like, I've been writing a lot on probability theory and how it relates to things like evidence. And I thought you were firing on all cylinders.
I appreciate that. That means a lot coming from you. I'm like fangirling now, but so do you just want me to just kind of go through the slides and kind of briefly go over what my conception?
Yes, please. Yeah. I think this is super important.
Yeah.
This is why Mike chose the wrong hill to die on, because he kept asking questions during the debate, like, well, how's that evidence? How's, like, he would just say, I think he referred to, he was like, well, if the universe has a cause, how is that evidence for theism? Yep. And I wanted to be, and I was, looking at the screen going, he gave you that answer. That's an answer he gave you.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, from a bird's eye view, my conception of evidence is just anything that raises the probability of a given theory. And so you can give a deductive arguments and all this other stuff. Mike's the kind of guy that says arguments are not evidence, and I kind of go through how you can actually test logical proofs just like we can mathematical proofs. I gave examples here, and then I went through the whole. I'm sure you're aware of what the gumball analogy, the jelly bean analogy is, but I just kind of went through this and kind of showed how a data point like an orange jelly bean here, in this instance, would be evidence that we pulled out of jar 2 over jar 1 because orange is more expectable given the hypothesis of jar 2, and we can predict that we would pull more orange jelly beans out of jar 2 than we would jar 1. And so I kind of formalized it towards the end too, by putting into kind of Bayesian terms. Is there anything else you wanted me to kind of hit on?
No. Let me share my screen now. Okay, y'all can see my screen?
I can now.
Sweet. So I don't have a whole lot more to add to Dan's characterization of evidence. So the only thing that I would say is that maybe it's my old-fashioned simplistic ways of thinking from the Enlightenment that I want to have kind of this simple principle that underlies my concept of evidence. And so I think that principle is the law of likelihood. And so, in the same vein as Dan, I want to say that we can understand evidence as any observation that probabilistically favors some proposition being true. And so that according to the law of likelihood, some observation is evidence for a hypothesis rather than another hypothesis if the probability of the first hypothesis is greater than the probability of the observation given the second hypothesis. And so this is just straightforward definition of conditional probability. And so I think when you have this concept of evidence on the table, when someone asks as a question, meaning it to be an objection, the question is being put forward as, kind of a reductio ad absurdum. And they say, how does the universe having a cause, how is that evidence for theism? The way that would be evidence for theism is the probability that the universe has a cause given theism is greater than the probability of the universe having a cause given not theism.
Yeah.
That's how. Like, if that probability statement is true, then it just follows that there is at least some evidence for theism, which is why I think this is just the wrong hill to die on, right? Like, we can offer defeaters for why, hey, maybe this isn't actually a piece of evidence, or we can offer a defeater in the sense of, hey, look, this evidence is outweighed by some other consideration. But he didn't do that. And I feel like you laid out your premises pretty clearly. And so I wanted to go over what I thought were the most critical ones, the ones in which, like, hey, you're absolutely making this claim here and justifying this claim here. There are times when, at least from my observation of the debate, where, Mike pressed you and said, you haven't provided any justification for, so-and-so claim. That wasn't true.
Yeah, I was really frustrated when he said that.
You labeled them, like you numbered the premises. So walk us through kind of your formulation of the kalam, and then I'll kind of go over the ways in which I see it from there, and because I'm not going to be able to improve a whole lot on the form.
Yeah. Cool. So this is the kalam that I used. It's Locke's most recent formulation of it. Did you want me to read through all the
Andrew
premises?
Locke's. Yeah. So you don't have to, obviously you don't have to read the whole thing verbatim, but like just kind of the basic idea. Just
right. So pretty much it's just saying that there is a series of causes and events, and that the chain of causes is either actually infinite or it's not, or the chain of causes is either a circular or it's not. I argue that 3 and 4 are true, that it's not infinite and it's not circular. So we get to a first cause. Then I argue that the first cause would have to be initially changeless. 9 is a really important one because I argue that the first cause would have to have some sort of agency. It'd have to be powerful. And that's pretty much like the gist of it from a bird's eye view again. I argue for first cause. I argue that it'd have to be beginning uncaused, beginningless, initially changeless, has agency, and be powerful. And kind of putting those together, the conclusion is that if you put all those together, there's a creator of the universe. 11 is true, therefore a creator of the universe exists.
Okay, so let me share my screen now. Y'all can see it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is broadly how I see Than's cosmological argument. So I see it divided into 4 stages, and whether or not there's a 4th stage or not might be it's something we can discuss.
Mhm.
So I think that the first stage of the kalam cosmological argument is to establish that the universe, the totality of contingent things, is more likely finite than eternal, and that the second stage is that the finite universe is more likely has a cause than is uncaused. And then the third stage is that the cause of the finite universe is more likely personal and impersonal, and that a personal cause of the universe in stage 4 is more likely given theism than atheism. So if we look at how Than defined theism in the beginning, his definition was that God is a metaphysically ultimate mind that is omnipotent and morally perfect. So it seems to me that there is this 4th stage
Yep.
to Than's argument. Now, that doesn't have to necessarily be the case. Someone who's, say a deist might say, look, there might be this personal cause of the universe, but that's not evidence for theism. So this is one way. So, if Mike kind of had taken the time to, kind of understand the argument that you're putting forward and kind of see it as, this broader case that you're trying to make, he might have seen this and been able to press back. Well, what are you trying to argue for? Are you just arguing for a personal first cause of the finite universe, or are you arguing for perfect being theism? And so it sounds, Dan, I'll let you turn it over to you now. What was it that you were trying to make a case for?
Yeah, so I made a mistake by putting in the omni properties in my definition of God, because I wasn't arguing for that. That's a different argument that I'd put up. So that was just like a basic mistake that I made in my preparation for my debate notes. But this version of the kalam, my goal was really just to say there's a powerful first cause that's an agent behind the universe.
So I want to now look at, there's a famous distinction in discussions about the problem of evil known as the logical problem of evil and the evidential problem of evil. And so while I don't really think these distinctions are all that important, like the soundness of the arguments, I don't think really it's not an interesting feature, this distinction. However, I do think that this distinction allows us to see the logic of different arguments much, much clearer. So most people are probably familiar with the kalam in a deductive form, or what we would call a logical form. And so if you look at the document that I have here, I've kind of broken the logic out. So like if someone were to challenge Than's argument, say like, this argument is invalid, that's clearly not the right objection to be putting forward. Because it's very easy to see how if we start with the case for the universe being finite rather than eternal, if we say that the universe is finite rather than eternal, then the universe has a cause. It just straightforwardly follows by modus ponens that the universe has a cause. And so I just do this with each step through those 4 stages. But now people like William Lane Craig and Than, you might make a similar move. They say, well, with a deductive argument, all you have to establish is that the premises are more likely than their negations. Well, so that's going to put us in kind of this evidential form. What does it mean for something to be more probable than its negation? Well, it turns out that Than gave us an answer to this question when he characterized evidence probabilistically. Wow. And so that's what I try to do here with kind of my inductive formulation of the kalam. And so we can see how the kalam has an evidential form that follows these 4 stages. So if you accept these 4 stages, you get to the claim that there is a fact that is evidence in a probabilistic sense for theism over atheism. Now, whether or not that's decisive or not, this argument doesn't give you an answer. A deductive one would. Deductive one would settle that question. We're probably more, and Than, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Than's giving more the more modest case in that, look, we have so he gave an a priori argument for the finitude of the past. And so if you accept that, and then you accept the causal principle that he appealed to, I think it was his premise 3.
Yep.
No,
it was premise
7.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yes.
Okay.
Premise 7. He appeals to it there. If you accept that premise, then it follows here.
Yep.
If you accept that this cause has, this is where I think the argument is weakest in these steps. I think that it's strongest in these steps and it's weakest in these steps. If you lay it out in this way, we can have a very productive conversation. But it's very obvious, I think, from this that the objection of, well, how is it evidence for theism or atheism? The objection that's meant to be implied by asking that rhetorical question just falls flat.
Yeah. No, you hit the nail on the head. The way I view everything that I believe is true, like I'm a probabilist. I Bayesian confirmation theories. So you hit it right on the head.
So the other move that I couldn't help but laugh at, and I'm not entirely sure I understand it. So perhaps Mike will do a response video to this and help explain it to me better. But he basically, once we got to this step right here, he was willing to say, the universe is finite and has a cause, but the cause is impersonal rather than personal. And so I don't disagree with this move in principle. I would make a similar move. However, his premises were that the alternative hypothesis was an eternal artichoke, and that somehow Occam's razor comes into play to shave off an assumption. I'm not sure what assumption Occam's razor is shaving off here. And again, I'm really, truly, honestly not trying to misrepresent Mike. And so maybe there's just something deeper here that I'm missing.
No, that's clearly what was said. And so I wanted to kind of put this in there. There are such a misunderstanding of Occam's razor. It's we don't multiply entities beyond the need, and it's just the principle of parsimony. It would seem that the more parsimonious explanation would be a better explanation. It doesn't follow that it's true, but it just seems it would be intuitionally a better explanation than complicating it. And to put a magic artichoke in there and give it all of these different properties seems to violate the very principle he was trying to skirt.
So what I think was happening, and so this is me kind of speculating, so take that for what it's worth, is that the magic artichoke was really a placeholder for a naturalistic theory that Mike did not have, either because he didn't understand it or because he's just not familiar with the naturalistic alternatives for an impersonal cause of the universe, something like Graham Oppie would put forward, because it seemed like he just kind of kept appealing to different authorities, people like Sean Carroll. I don't get me wrong, I have tremendous respect for Sean Carroll, but I don't have much respect for moves such as, just saying quantum mechanics, just like as some response. Well, quantum mechanics says, okay, that's that's it. There's clearly some very difficult cosmology and even more difficult, fundamental physics at the bottom of all this, and just saying terms like quantum mechanics doesn't really doesn't really get you out of this unless you have something more to say here. And I just don't think he had that something more to say. And that's okay. That's again, people in my camp, I cannot stress this enough. Like, this is just the part where you say, I just don't know. Yep. And that's not going to be a blow if you don't accept a discussion in which the question is there evidence for theism?
Yeah.
Well, not only that, appealing to quantum mechanics is literally appealing to the study of the quantum. I mean, which interpretation is supposed to be the undercutting defeater? Which,
That's just it. It's very nebulous. So when you say that, like, so I think, you correct me if I'm wrong, Than, Than was saying, I gave an argument for why there cannot be an infinite past series of events. And Mike's response was something along the lines, and obviously I'm paraphrasing, so if I'm getting this wrong, please correct me in the comments. He said something along the lines, no, we can have an eternal universe because quantum mechanics. That's insufficient. He might be right. There might be something about quantum mechanics. I think there's something about quantum mechanics that's right, but like you have to say something more. If you're going to engage with the argument, you have to say, what is it about quantum mechanics that helps us understand the argument that Than is putting forward? I don't think at no point that I could discern in that discussion did Mike give any sort of substantive interaction, or the term I'm really liking right now that I've got from the Classical Theist podcast is, the clash between arguments. That there's these two views. There's either the arguments on Mike's side versus the arguments on Than's side, or Mike's worldview versus Than's worldview clashing with each other, interacting with each other. That just didn't happen. I didn't see that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's pretty much, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. More specifically, he just kept on saying that there were models of the universe that show that they could be past infinite. And then I said, well, the thing that got me was when he asked me, well, are you saying you know more than cosmologists? I was like, well, no, I'm not saying that, but.
So I don't know what to say about those moves. I don't want to psychologize his motivations, because I don't know him. I don't know what they are. But I do know that as far as a dialectical is concerned, if we're trying to understand these arguments better, that just wasn't the right move. So I want to turn the tables is not the right phrase, but that's the phrase that comes to my mind. Turn the tables a little bit here and say, what was the objection that you were most prepared to try to answer? Because from what I got from the debate, it was Mereological nihilism. It seemed like you kind of, like in your opening statement, you were like, in anticipation of a move, you had arguments against Mereological nihilism, but then in the actual debate itself, didn't really seem like he defended sort of Mereological nihilism. What was the objection that you came prepared to try to address? Or, maybe it was, arguments are not evidence. I'm sorry about that trope. I'm sure you had something to say to that.
Yeah. So those were the two big ones that I prepared for, like that I anticipated from him, because I've seen his past debates. Because when I finally accepted the debate with him, I spent a few hours studying his past debates, his videos, and all this other stuff. And so the two big ones that he always mentions were arguments are not evidence and Mereological nihilism against the causal principle. But then I also, I sent you the slides, and then I don't know if you looked through them, but then, for instance, with my argument against traversing an actual infinite, I had objections that Oppie, Morriston, Malpass, and some others have made against that argument. And I made, I think, like 5 slides in anticipation that just in case Mike would have done some studying on some of these things. But there's a lot of different things that I prepared for, but those were the two big ones.
Those are the two big ones. Gotcha. So for those listening, when it comes to cosmological arguments in general, and this is especially people from my camp, the major objections to these arguments are not that arguments are not evidence, nor is it that you have to kind of go all in on Mereological nihilism. Now, the question of, what is the true view of parts and wholes? Mereology is the study of parts, wholes. I can just be entirely agnostic about in this discussion. And nothing would turn on that. Than's argument would still be on the table. Now, I think that the most serious objection to cosmological arguments and teleological arguments in general is what's known as the gap problem. So there's this idea that we have to get from personal cause of the universe to perfect being. And that something like a cosmological argument or a teleological argument cannot, in principle, undercut an argument from evil. And so that if you're putting the two arguments on the table, the argument from evil is going to always outweigh.
Yep.
And so to me, that's the most pressing problem for this argument, because you can accept it in its entirety, except for the final move. I go back to my right here, this move right here.
Yep.
The idea that it's the probability that the personal cause of the universe is a perfect being is greater than if it was not a perfect being. And so if we're construing, so there's another distinction I should make here. Atheism in a narrow sense and atheism in a wide sense. So atheism in a narrow sense is just going to deny perfect being theism. Whereas atheism in a wide sense is going to deny gods in general. It's going to deny not only perfect being theism, but things like theism or deism and panentheism and polytheism. But so generally what's taken in these discussions is one about narrow theism. It's about the denial of perfect being theism. So this is why I said at the beginning, this is where, Thang can avoid this move very easily by just not defining theism as perfect being theism, by just sticking to this wider theistic conception where the problem of evil has no bite.
Yep.
So I don't want to ramble too much, so I'll let Than.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And that's my favorite part of the conversations, really. It's that theory comparison at that point. Like, what's the probability with all these different arguments that we have with divine hiddenness? I think teleological suffering for me is like one of the scariest arguments. So, yeah.
With the gap problem, if we were going to put that on the table, what would be your go-to kind of response?
Well, before we get there, I was interested in one of the things you guys were talking about. I didn't want to get too far away from it.
Oh, you're fair. You're good.
On Mereological nihilism, how does Mereological nihilism affect causality? I understand it's they're really the parts to a whole is all that exists, not the whole itself. Is it just that denying these relations is what affects the causal principle?
So I can speculate. Than, do you have something to say? I'll have his speculations.
Yeah, this is speculation as well for me, because but from the way I see it, if you deny any sort of composition, then all there is mereological simples, and thereby follows that nothing actually begins to exist unless you want to call arrangements of particles something that begin to exist. But
right, okay,
that's just the way I see it.
Yeah, I was interested in that aspect, and for those in the audience who's not familiar with Mereological nihilism, it's pretty hard to wrap your head around if you're not familiar with it. So we won't try to explain it here. But
I still can't wrap my head around.
So we'll move on and get it back into the substance of the rest of the argument.
Well, I'm really curious.
Which is why I said that it's, if someone who's skeptical of this argument doesn't have to go all in on Mereological nihilism.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems to be a move that I've seen a few people make. So that's why I was kind of interested in because I mean, at the end of the day, it just seems with mereological nihilism, we're just saying that there's, these simples, these fundamentals, and we're just kind of assuming that they exist as just fundamentals. And I guess you would have to argue why they don't, just foundationally or fundamentally exist would be the position that one would have to argue against.
What were you going to say about that, Ben?
Yeah, so I would want to say again. Let me pull it back. Y'all can see my screen, right?
Yep.
So this last claim, actually, no. I've said something about this claim with the gap problem.
Yeah.
So to say something about this claim, that the universe is finite and has a cause is more likely given a personal cause than an impersonal cause. I think that there are naturalistic alternatives here. So, in other words, I think that we can concede the argument up until this point, and we really, to this point, like I'm not, I have my own skepticisms about these moves. But what I'm saying is, for the sake of argument, we can suppose that these moves work. But then once we get to this move, there's some other, I think, very plausible naturalistic alternatives on the table. And so I'm not saying that I know that this view is true, because I don't. I'm not a cosmologist, and there's obviously people much smarter than me that are working on these problems. And I consider my area of expertise in moral philosophy, not cosmology. So I'm not going to pretend to know more than I do in these areas. But I would plug Alyssa Ney's latest book, The World in the Wave Function. And
real quick, Ben, can you verbalize for the podcast audience who's only going to hear the audio what the move that you're talking about now?
Yes. So the move, let me just start from the beginning to just kind of trace out what's happening here, because that's a very good point. I've kind of been leaning on these visuals here. So for the people that are listening and don't have the luxury of these visuals, the first claim here is that there are facts about Big Bang cosmology, or there are a priori mathematical arguments to the conclusion that the universe is finite rather than eternal. And so that the fact that the universe is finite is more likely giving that the universe has a cause than if the universe was uncaused. And so that's the famous principle, whatever begins to exist has a cause, is, kind of the famous principle that underlies that move. And so what you end up with in this third stage of the kalam is that the universe is finite and has a cause, and that cause is probably personal rather than impersonal. And so I want to challenge that probabilistic claim and say that no, there are impersonal causal models of a finite universe that are just as plausible. And so the one that I want to just kind of offer up right now is Alyssa Ney's model from The World is in the Wave Function. It's also similar to Jill North's The Structure of a Quantum World. That's a paper for those who are interested in kind of reading more about this. And so this view doesn't really have a name, and so I've just been calling it atemporal wave function monism. And so this is the view that the most fundamental concrete thing that exists is the universal wave function of quantum mechanics, and that all other phenomena in the causal domain emerge from this universal wave function. And so that every possible state of the universe is actual. The universal wave function is the wave function or quantum state of the totality of existence. And it's regarded as the basic physical entity or the fundamental entity that at all times is obeying a deterministic wave equation. And so on this view, the universal wave function is necessary. It's timeless, since wave functions don't have space-time variables in them. This wave function is purely actual. It's spaceless and it's sui generis, meaning it's uncaused. But there's another feature about this universal wave function that I think is very important here. It's not personal. It's indifferent to the nature and condition of sentient life in the universe. And so this is a model that not only we can concede all these steps in the Kalam cosmological argument, but also does not conflict with the conclusion of an argument from evil. We would say that the universe is more likely indifferent to suffering than it is that there's this perfectly loving being that cares about the well-being of sentience. And so that's what I would say. The first objection that I laid for was the gap problem that challenged this premise. Well, the second objection would want to challenge this move here and say that no, there's this atemporal universal wave function monism view that we can have on the table that can concede these moves here, but block this move to a personal being.
So just to sum it up, it's the inductive part of getting to the personal creator.
Yes, I'm not offering what's called a rebutting defeater here.
Right.
I'm not saying that, like, oh, look, hey, this view is true, and that's why this other view is false. I'm saying, look, this is what's called an undercutting defeater.
Yep.
It's meant to cast doubt on this probability judgment here.
So
that's all that this is meant to do. This doesn't require me to say, like, I have to prove that, I have to put forward some sort of proof. I don't have to appeal to some sort of scientific consensus. Just say, look, this is a model that could go on the table that is an undercutting defeater. And it engages with the argument as it is, in its most modest yet strongest form.
Does she interact with the field, fields being the fundamental part of reality? Is that something that, we would go further and say, if the wave function collapses or the wave function is fundamental, wouldn't the fields be even more fundamental, or does she even address that?
So she says that the universal wave function is the basic physical entity.
Okay.
So Graham Oppie has a similar view, and Felipe Leon have a similar view, where this is the initial state of the universe, and the initial state of the universe is necessary.
Right.
And so this universal wave function, what it describes, this is a law of nature, and everything follows from this universe. And now, so the natural question to ask right now is, well, what does this universal wave function look like? And so, like, that's the weakness of this view. This view, we don't have a quantum theory of gravity yet. We don't have a unifying theory of quantum mechanics and general relativity. And because we don't have that unifying theory yet, we can only speculate about what that universal wave function looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is where I would also cast doubt on the idea, we might be tempted to think that we can rule out an infinite universe a priori by just sitting in our armchairs. But I don't think we're going to be able to do that. I'm skeptical of those arguments because I think what we're going to have to do is kind of the really deep cosmology, that the theoretical cosmology that's happening at something like CERN, that's establishing the basic, the standard model of particle physics. Of course, we're going to have to do something like that in order to determine whether the universe as a whole, the totality of contingent things, is infinite or finite. And I just don't think anyone really knows right now.
Right.
I hate that. There's no part of me that likes saying that out loud.
I know.
Well, I think but the overarching theme here is while it's not an undercutting defeater, it's a rebutting defeater. So now we need a symmetry breaker.
Exactly.
Why would we take?
And that's the conversation we were trying to have. That's the conversation that we were trying to have. That's the conversation Than was trying to have. Right. That was the kind of conversation I showed up to watch.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. What is the symmetry breaker? Why would we, when we have a decent rebutting, defeater for it, what is it to choose one over the other? So,
but I also don't think that it's a cost to skeptics or naturalists to just say, so this is an evidential chip. I'll go ahead and lay my cards on the table. That I think does favor theism. That I think that if the datum is that the universe is finite, then that's at least some, like, granted, there's these 4 stages. There's a lot of moves in there. So I'm not going to say this is strong evidence, but I'll at least concede that it's weak evidence. But I think there's stronger datum. So this is where I would criticize Than, in that I think that because he agreed to the question, is there evidence for God, just use a datum that's easier, that doesn't have 4 stages.
Yeah.
Appeal to something like moral agency or religious experience. Do religious experiences.
So like, I wanted to, but anytime I've ever talked to him about that kind of stuff, he just kind of pulls the how would you just, I don't know how to describe it. You think your hallucinations were evidence of your God, stuff, that kind of stuff. And I wanted to try to avoid that rhetorical battle as much as I could, because that's why I hate debates.
So I think the strongest, so if I were put my theist cap and put myself in your shoes, I would appeal to moral agency. And I would say, look, the probability of observing a moral agent given theism is 1. Because God is a moral agent.
Yeah.
Theism literally entails a moral agent. All right. Naturalism does not entail moral agents. It just doesn't entail. Now, you might say, oh, no, look, they're really probable in naturalism. They're like really, really, really probable in naturalism. Even if that were the case, it doesn't entail them.
Yeah.
It's just always like, and there's a famous principle that I think is really important that gets overlooked a lot in the probability calculus called the weak anthropic principle. So the weak anthropical principle basically just says, look, we have to account for the fact that we are observers in the universe and that the universe is compatible with observers. And so that's old evidence. Mm-hmm. That's part of our background data, is that the universe is compatible with observers. So what does that mean? Well, it means that consciousness doesn't favor either naturalism or theism, because the weak anthropic principle entails conscious observers. Mm-hmm. However, the weak anthropic principle does not entail that these observers are moral agents.
Yeah. So
one of the strongest objections to teleological arguments here just doesn't even apply to moral agents. So if your burden is only to establish that there is a consideration that favors theism over naturalism, moral agency is the easiest one because it gets you there in one step.
Yeah.
That one step is super difficult to avoid.
Yep. Well, but then wouldn't you have to at least justify the position in the more realist position?
Yep. Sure. Fine. So if someone says, like, there are no, like, that's one way to avoid it. Like, there just are no moral agents. Okay. Well, now the conversation is shifted to, now the question turns on, is it more plausible that there are moral agents or not moral agents? I think the moral skeptic loses that dialectic.
Yeah, I do too. But that's a really good point. I've tried in the past. I've given him arguments for moral realism, and they were just always strawmanned. And
so it's my claim also does not assume moral realism. I guess it does in one. So it assumes that there is something like intrinsic value, mm-hmm. and that there are agents that make morally significant decisions, or that I don't think this is a datum, but other people do. Libertarian free will. Mm-hmm. If moral agency implies libertarian free will, and libertarian free will is more likely on theism than naturalism.
Mm-hmm.
That's just another way in which
Yeah.
moral agency favors theism instead of naturalism. And so I think that if you were to ask me, like, what is the strongest argument for theism, I'm going to point to that one every time.
Yeah.
Because there are no good dialectical moves for the naturalist other than to just bite the bullet and say, look, okay, this is an evidential chip that falls in favor of theism. However, there are these other evidential chips. That's not the end of the story. And that's okay. Like, it's okay for skeptics to just concede that, like, look, there can be evidence. Like, all the evidential chips don't have to fall in your camp. The reality is just more complex than that.
Yeah.
It's not that clean and neat.
And that's a very good point, because one of the things that I try to hammer home over and over again is theism or non-theism is abductive. It's which pieces of evidence do you think falls for theism and which pieces do you think falls for non-theism? And at the end of the day, when we weigh all these pieces, it usually people just they err on the side of what's more plausible to them or what they're convinced of. That's why I don't think that atheism itself is irrational, because I think it's an abductive case. It's what's more plausible to you given these different pieces of evidence that could go either way.
For anyone who's familiar with my work, they'll know that I'm very fond of saying exactly what Eddie just said. To echo it is that to just dispense with things like burdens of justification and just let evidential chips fall where they may. That's the right. We should let evidential chips fall where they may, and then proportion our beliefs to the evidence. That's just kind of the basic guiding intuition that I use in the philosophy of religion. And I don't know, maybe I'm naive. Maybe there's some just really weird trick with artichokes and Occam's razor that I just don't get.
Well, that's the thing. And, I would be one of the first to admit, the two huge chips in the equation is divine hiddenness and the evidential problem of evil that and suffering. I still struggle as a theist with those two.
Those are the big chips. I think those are the big chips on the one side, but then I think there are other chips elsewhere kind of scattered in there. But to my mind, those are the two really, really big ones that, I think people really struggle with them, not only intellectually, but also existentially. I think people really struggle with the bad things that happen in the world. And I think people really struggle with what seems to be God's silence.
Yeah. And talking about the evidence, to kind of put it in a Bayesian analysis or form, every bit of evidence counts and every bit of evidence adds up. Even if it's a small evidence, we still have, different chips of evidence, as you said, that can accumulate to a point where, one hypothesis just appears to be more plausible than the other. It doesn't have to have, we have super evidence here and no super evidence over here, so the super evidence wins out. It's an accumulative case.
Yep.
I fancy myself these days as something of a Hegelian. And so, I wasn't going to be able to have this conversation without
Hegel's got to come up at least.
Hegel's got to come up somewhere. I apologize, but I don't apologize. So one of Hegel's themes that you find through is that the history of knowledge, the progression of human knowledge, is not a series of weighing all the theories and then saying, okay, I can cast this philosophy aside, I can cast this philosophy aside, and here's the one true philosophy. Hegel understands knowledge much more dynamically than that, and saying that the tensions and the battles that have happened between competing views over time are still important, so that there's a lot to be gleaned, even if we don't think some argument works on one side of a debate. just the very discussion that's being had between these two competing views, each side of those views gets something right. And so that we have to use the Hegelian jargon, we have to sublate these disagreements and take away what's true about both of them and let fall away what is false about them. And so what this means is that we can't just, it's not a matter of just adding up all the theories and then picking the one true theory and saying that all the others are false. No, you're going to have to get something from each one.
Yep.
Something important is gotten within each of those perspectives.
Yeah.
But that's a Hegelian theme. It can be controversial. A lot of people don't, but I think it's right. I think that there's something fundamentally right, that the progression of human knowledge is just standing on each other's shoulders.
Yep.
And, as people fall away, there are some people left standing on other people's shoulders. And so you can eventually see higher and higher and higher, but there's huge, like, I do not agree with classical theism. Like, I think classical theism is just straight up incoherent and false. However, I have learned a ton from studying classical theism. Like, I just cannot begin to emphasize the metaphysical tools that I've gotten in my tool bag, and the distinctions that I can draw now, the language games that I can participate in by just studying classical theism. And it's made my own model, my own worldview building that much richer.
Yep.
Yeah, I actually the other day was just going through Hegel's dialectics, and he is, man,
terrible to read. He's awful. He's awful. Just the worst to read. And I get that. And what's even more infuriating, it'll make you even more mad, is that it's deliberate. Like, that he wants you, like, there's actually a method to the madness. Like, he makes you think about his own writing in a way that makes his method more obvious. And so you can't get his methodology unless you just struggle with how he writes. So it's deliberate. To me, that makes it worse.
Yeah, I started with the problem of the one and the many and ended up in dialectics. And I was just, my head hurt.
I'm not exaggerating to people either. Like, when I first tackled the phenomenology of spirit, I mean, I really tackled, like, I poured over that book for like a year. And I mean, like 11 months, 12 months, like pretty much a year. Like, before, I had gotten over like the decoding process. And again, I'm getting carried away. I'm talking about Hegel too.
I was gonna say we could spend the next week.
Yeah, I'm using up fans. I'm using up fans.
No. I'm just here to soak in. I'm just here to soak in all the knowledge from you guys. So.
That's it. So back to where we were. There's so you have a competing hypothesis, a naturalistic competing hypothesis. And I think we all agree that the debate should have been the symmetry breaker between those competing hypotheses. Is there any other parts of the debate that you that really stuck out to you, Ben?
Yeah, so I guess I would take a little bit of issue with what you just said, in that that what you said is true if you assume that that's the question that they should have been discussing. Is that, is there any evidence for theism? That's a symmetry. However, I thought that the better question to ask would be, why is there something rather than nothing?
Yep.
Right.
And so then I think at that point, since we both have speculative views on the table, we'd have to have kind of like a Graham Oppie discussion where we start to weigh the theoretical virtues and vices of each view.
Yep.
Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to come to any determinate agreement here. We're not going to be able to resolve all of our disagreements here.
Yeah.
However, I think that we can have a super substantive discussion.
Yeah.
And again, I think that at the end of the day, switching back to that other question of, is there evidence for I think you just concede that. I think you just say, yes, there is evidence for theism, and don't die on the hill that there is no evidence for theism.
Yeah.
So like we could say, like, is there this symmetry breaker? You know, the debate should have been about the symmetry breaker between these two views. No. Mike's strongest move was to just concede. There is some evidence for theism. That was his strongest move. That's just not the move he agreed to.
Yeah.
In the discussion of the debate. I think he would have had an easier time tackling something, a bigger question, like why is there something rather than nothing? Because at that point you're putting two views that are roughly on equal footing. And you're just trying to see what comes. You're letting them clash. You're letting the arguments do all the work.
Yep.
You're there not to defeat the other person or use an argument like a weapon. You're there to try to resolve disagreement and grow and learn.
Make progress.
That's what the right answer looks like.
Yeah. No, I completely
totally
agree.
Like what I'm not saying that Eddie was wrong. Like what Eddie is saying is right. Given that you're that Mike's made these other really bad moves.
Right.
Well, I tried to. We ran out of time, but I gave him like a Rasmussen argument from limits, but then we ran out of time. That would have been my next move.
I don't think that those like that argument. This sounds really bad, and again, I don't know Mike, but I think that I don't think he even understood the main thesis of something like Josh Rasmussen's argument from arbitrary limits. Like I just like that's just something that's not like I'm pretty sure he doesn't understand how a modal collapse works either. Just like he doesn't understand, he just doesn't understand that argument either. Like he's not familiar with them, and that's not an objection against it. Not everyone can be familiar with everything all the time.
Yeah, that's totally fine. Subject. I don't expect everybody to.
Just admit that.
Yeah. Just like I'm happy to admit that, like, if you and I were to enter this kind of a conversation, it'd be a student to teacher one. And I'm happy with that.
Just being able to admit that, like, hey, like, we can have these conversations and disagreements, but yeah, I'll just concede that if the universe is finite, that's some evidence for theism over like I don't think you've dealt any serious blows to naturalism. I think you've only done all that you've done is be more modest in the claims that you're making, and you've progressed the conversation that you're having further by just increasing the common ground you have and having more interesting discussions. Mm-hmm. It's not as bad as, well, the definition of atheism is the lack of belief. That one really sucks when you can't get past the definition of the terms.
I usually just concede to that and move on.
I do too. It's not a hill to die on. Yeah, there's a term for that. It's called lack theism. We won't go into propositions and their negations and burdens and so was there Than, did you have any questions for Ben about anything that you presented that he might could give you a different idea about?
Just anything that you think, like I told you, Ben, I have like severe imposter syndrome. So all I saw was the flaws in my debate. So, but I'm also the kind of person that I'm never really happy with where I'm at. I want to keep growing and learning. So what were the biggest flaws that you saw in the debate from me?
I want to say the biggest one. So I wouldn't say that your flaws came in your technical presentation. I would say that your flaws came in kind of there were certain moves that you let him. He kind of baited you into, and you kind of took that bait and kind of ran off with it, and you just didn't need to. Yeah. And I'm trying. There's one. I haven't watched the debate in a couple days now, and I'm trying to remember the specific example I had in mind.
Yeah, he bit on a couple of red herrings, and that was one of the things that I had told him beforehand, because I've debated Mike before, and he's going to bring up things that's not pertinent to the debate. And
Yeah.
if you follow him down that rabbit trail, it's he tried
Yeah.
to burden shift.
Well, obviously the big one was the magic artichoke. So like you just like obviously shutting that silly objection down quickly and decisively can be hard in the moment to do. Like just it's hard to just do.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of time was spent on that part when you could have just continually dismissed it. Just been like, no, that's
It's not analogous.
you were hitting on it or around it too. Like I don't want to like sound like
Yeah.
you were missing this mark at all because look, you're just you're using a concept of God and you're just calling it a magic artichoke.
Yeah.
Like, so
Right.
You were hitting around. You like that's exactly how you have to approach that. You have to just kind of dismiss it. It's just being like, no, this isn't really a serious response to what I'm trying to say, and it's certainly not a serious cosmological model.
Yeah. I haven't seen the artichoke hypothesis before. I was kind of it seemed to be just another variation of the flying spaghetti monster.
Yeah.
And you mimic it at some point that the law of identity is going to step in, and it's going to be, you're literally talking about what I'm presenting as God. Yeah. And you're just calling it a different name. That's it.
Yeah.
So, I think it was William Lane Craig that had said, well, fantastic. We agree. God exists. You're just calling him something different. And I think those parodies, and I understand where Mike was going with it, looking for, a hypothesis naturalistically that could be competing. I just think it miserably failed.
Yeah. I love those theory comparison to conversations where you compare the ontology, the virtues, the simplicity, all this other stuff.
The clash in those discussions is really good between their arguments. Like you really get to go deep into what it is, and it really requires this rich concept of evidence that you sketched out too, and that just it's very clear that at least by my observation that Mike just wasn't. He just didn't have that concept. It just wasn't the concept that he was working with. And you could just ask it, but the rhetorical questions that he was asking, well, how is that evidence? Or how is that evidence? And I just sitting there hitting my head going, oh my God.
Yeah.
Like
the worst part.
He defined his terms. He literally did it all right. Like he gave an opening.
The worst part that got me was because I asked him, I didn't expect him to have my premises memorized. But I asked him what was premise 9 in my argument. And then eventually he admitted, well, I don't know. It was a boring opening.
It's not, that doesn't help. That's so unhelpful.
Well, when somebody has all those slides and they're going through them and the other person's not even writing, I think that kind of gives you an idea of where it's going to go. But I knew where it was going to go to begin with. I debated it, but we debated on the contingency, and he literally didn't even interact with the argument. I mean, just went straight to something else, and it was an argument he agreed on. And I made it as bare bones as possible. I was almost embarrassed at what I presented as an argument because I knew he wasn't going to prepare. But
hopefully he sees this, and hopefully he can take some constructive criticism from it. Because again, Mike's in my camp. I'm not
you
trying
want
to
him to do better.
Yeah, I'm not trying to tear him down,
right.
And I'm not trying to make fun of him. But I do want to, this is one of those things that's frustrating to me in my own camp is that I think sometimes people's egos get the better of them, and they end up in situations. I compare it a lot to martial arts. So there are levels to martial arts, and it's if you try to pretend to be in a level that you're not in, you can get embarrassed very quickly.
You're going to get exposed. That's right.
You get exposed very, very quickly, especially I train jiu-jitsu. And so if you're a white belt and you try to pretend to be a purple belt, you're going to have a bad time.
Yep.
Right.
But
and it all depends on where you got your white belt and purple belt.
Yeah. Philosophy is different, but it's the same in the sense there are levels to it. But the consequences for pretending to be at a level that you're are not as immediately obvious as they are. in martial arts. People, rhetoricians, people can just go out there
Dan
and
was an
just,
MMA guy. He knows he knows exactly how you can get embarrassed.
yeah. But there just isn't an analog in philosophy.
Right.
Other than what we would call like the hitch slap or
Yeah.
some
Well, philosophy has taught me I don't know what I thought I knew,
Gosh.
and when
Yeah.
I think when I
the
think
more I
know it,
learn,
yeah,
Socrates.
it's so bad. I used to be like, if you were to ask me, because I became a Christian about like 5 years ago. And if you were to ask me, even just last year, how confident are you in your Christianity? I'd be like, oh, 100%. It's a fact. It's a whoa. Right.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, yeah, probably like 70 to 90%. It depends on any given day. Sometimes, like I said, the scariest argument to me is the teleological suffering. Like, that killed me sometimes. And so that modesty just has to be there.
I agree.
That's the humbling part of philosophy, and there's a parallel there with martial arts too.
Yep.
You start martial arts and it'll humble you really quick when you get tapped out by a 5'3" girl that's all of 90 pounds soaking wet. You'll be like, hey, wow.
I had a situation like that.
That's what got me into jujitsu. Was
it's a humbling experience. It's a very humbling experience.
I went to a free class with a friend, and I was in my 20s, and a 16-year-old kid had me in an arm bar and tapped out in like 5 seconds, and I was like, "Holy crap! I want to learn this."
Yeah.
So it'll definitely humble you. That's for sure. So we're gonna wrap it all up. I don't want anybody to take away from this. This is not a Mike slam session. It's about the debate. He was ill prepared. And I'm with Ben on this. I hope he watches this and takes it as constructive criticism. Seems like a pretty decent guy. I don't have anything personal against him. I know Than doesn't. And we just want to keep it in the intellectual sphere and attack it there. And I think we've done a pretty good job of that. And anybody who would take something else from this, email me. We'll reevaluate it and see if we made some mistakes along the way or not. But other than that, I'd like to let you two plug your stuff to close out.
Cool. Ben, you can go first.
Yeah, so check out Real Atheology, a philosophy of religion podcast. We are on iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, YouTube. We have a Facebook page. We have a Twitter page. We have an Instagram. So check us out. We're on all the social medias and podcast outlets, whatever your favorite one happens to be. And stay tuned for more content. We've got some exciting interviews lined up for the future. So stay tuned.
Then you can catch me at Exploring Reality. I'm on YouTube, on TikTok. I'm working on a website as well. That's about it. That's all I'll add. And I want to say thank you to Eddie and Ben. It's super humbling to me that two like super smart people wanted to talk to somebody like me. I'm not near the level you guys are at. So I just really appreciate being able to soak in the knowledge.
Yeah. I do appreciate that, but I think you're being a bit a little strong with your words. I don't know about at the level of knowledge for that, I would say. But we're all in this to learn more and to present our arguments better. And I definitely appreciate you, Dan, coming on and willing to expose your arguments, your positions in the debate, from the debate, and be open to that criticism. That says a lot to your intellectual honesty and humility. And Ben, I really appreciate you reaching out and wanting to do this and give a good, honest assessment and, kind of give us some better retorts, kind of the things we would have expected to begin with. So thank both of you guys for coming on and doing this.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to put you guys in the back, tell everybody bye. I'll be back there in a minute.
Cool.
thank you everybody for joining us. I have a couple of shows coming up. I've got Russ Schaefer Landau. It's going to be the 28th, and I have Stephen Law is going to be coming on. We haven't nailed down a date yet, but it's going to be in November for sure. And again, thank you, Than. Thank you, Ben. Their links is in the description. Make sure you check their stuff out. Both of them have very good content, very cool guys, very humble. And thank you, everybody, again for coming out.